Hi, everyone. This is Yenvy. Thank you for joining me today. We are in the second part of last week's genomics and GLP-1, personalized nutrition, and we have Meryl here again. Today, we actually dive deeper into the GLP-1 medication and how that impacts your DNA and also how you should eat around that, whether you're thinking about it, whether you're on it, or you've already gone through the cycle of GLP-1s. What's happening in the body? What are we eating alongside it? Because I know there's a lot of different side effects while you're on it as well, and then there's some side effects afterwards, and then we're still in this phase of what are the long-term side effects. And so we're hearing a lot of different things in the media from doctors and from research of what we're starting to learn. And I think having more knowledge around what is it exactly, and then what are some of the theories and thoughts and thesis around what will happen in the future, or what and also the prevention aspect of it. And so Meryl's here. She's going to go through it with us. I'm so appreciative that she's here. Our part one, if you didn't watch it, it's on our YouTube channel. But I got a lot of compliments from that first one, just because there was a lot of really strong information for individuals to take away so that they know how to just live a nutritious lifestyle. Okay. Before we get started, I need to read a disclaimer. This webinar is for educational and informational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any diseases. The content shared by Meryl Brandwein and Yenvy Truong is based on their professional experience and current research in the fields of functional nutrition and healthcare. It should not be interpreted as medical advice or a substitute for consultation with a qualified medical advice or a substitute for consultation with a qualified healthcare provider. Always consult your physician or qualified health professional before making any changes to your diet. Medication or lifestyle participation in this webinar does not establish a client-practitioner relationship. All right, so I'll go ahead and hand it over to Meryl. Great to have you again, Meryl.
Thank you so much. So happy to be here and welcome back, everybody. Hopefully, you're here for round two. If you missed round one, definitely go back. It'll connect the dots a little bit better. And let me get started. So, yes, today we're going to talk about how your GLP-1 medications and DNA should shape what you eat. Let me also say this should shape what you eat regardless if you're on the GLP-1s, right? We're going to go through some recommendations that suit anybody. So, whether you're on them or not, this is applicable. A little bit about me. I gave a pretty in-depth account last week, so you can go back if you want to know more about me. But suffice to say, I've been in this industry over 25 years. I consider myself a lifelong learner. So I've got many certifications in the area of genomics, in the area of immunology, in the area of functional medicine and functional nutrition. This is my life's work and my passion. I love what I do. And I got here as my own, from my own health journey, and I continue on my own health journey. But I basically was diagnosed with cancer when I was about 33. I had just given birth. I was about 6 weeks postpartum after giving birth to my third child. I have a son and two daughters, and went through chemo and radiation, was left with a pretty debilitated immune system, ended up seeking out alternative and integrative treatment in Mexico. And that's literally what changed my life. I was introduced to these physicians who were world renowned in the area of oncology, integrative oncology. And it really opened up a whole new window of how to see health from a root cause approach and really understanding how do we look at the body. So I always say, if you look at a tree and the leaves are brown, it's not like you can't spray the leaves a color and make it look good, right? You have to go to the root. And that's how our bodies work. You got to go underneath and look at how and what is going on in our biochemistry and physiology. And if you're not doing that, then you're missing a huge piece of the puzzle. So we talk about the pillars of health and the work that I do because nutrition is just a small part of the pillars, right? I think I gave the analogy like a house, right? If you build a house, you have to have a solid foundation or everything falls apart. Same thing in our bodies. If we don't have a solid foundation for how we are supporting our health and well-being, nothing will stick. It can't just be about one thing. And so it's about how do we learn to balance all of these things, address all of these things, And the more consistent we are in our habits, the easier all of this becomes because it becomes a part of who we are. If you're looking at all of this and you're saying, oh my gosh, this looks hard, well, maybe it's just because all of these areas are slightly imbalanced. Once we get back into balance, it it really does level out. And it's, I always say, if you hit the nail on the head in the right way, everything falls from there. So I had talked about this last week. Health is not a one size fits all approach. And I think a lot of what we see on social media, a lot of what we hear from our physicians or healthcare providers, it's like just trying to fit you into the box of you have this symptom, take this medication. And that's really not what health is about. We are all unique and we are all individual. And as we get into the world of genetics, it's even more so, right? We see this compounded effect of genetics and health. So that's important to look at. And I mentioned last week that our genes respond to our lifestyle, meaning, yes, we can have genetic predispositions, but it's our lifestyle that determines how our genes respond. So I say genetics loads the gun, but our lifestyle really pulls the trigger. The other thing that we want to look at, and again, this is repeating from last week, but it's important that you remember this as we go through this second part, because epigenetics, which is everything outside of our genes, which you'll see again here because I want to hit home the point, but everything outside of our actual genetics, so our environment, our diet, our lifestyle, our toxins we're exposed to, the emotions we're exposed to in our brain, all of these things impact how our genes literally turn on and turn off. So it's important to really understand that because genetics is a small piece of the story. So we all think, oh, I have someone in my family who had heart disease. I had someone in my family who had cancer or breast cancer, or whatever it is. And you're like, well, am I going to get it? So genetics is a very, very small piece. So 20 to 30% of what actually gets expressed in our bodies is genetics, which means 70 to 80% we have control over. So there's so many studies out there that actually prove that many of the chronic diseases we are dealing with, whether it's cardiovascular disease, diabetes, even cancer, high blood pressure, osteoporosis, autoimmune diseases, all of these things can be tied back to preventable. These are preventable diseases. And we know that diet and lifestyle have somewhere between an 80 to 85, even 90% role in this. So really important. And even Alzheimer's, and Yenvy and I were talking about this before we came on, they're calling Alzheimer's diabetes type 3. Why? Because it is a function of what we see in diabetes as a metabolic disorder. So just because you may have a genetic predisposition doesn't mean it's going to happen. And so this is so important to pay attention to and focus on. So why your diet needs a DNA and GLP-1 upgrade, right? Well, because if you look at what we used to follow, the food pyramid, which we know is outdated, and if you don't know that it was designed by all of the private interest industries, it's like whichever group won out at the time, whether it's the meat industry, the dairy industry, the grain industry. So very little of this was really devised on science and scientific information for our bodies. A lot of it was political. And so makes no sense to follow the food pyramid. But next to this is, this is actually a picture from one of our reports. And so it really tells us what nutrients do we need to pay attention to for you. And that's the most important thing. So we know that personalized nutrition actually does make a difference. This is a study in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Now, this was a while ago, right? You see, it's 2016. And so there's more relevant data today, but we know that right after the intervention, the med diet scores were greater in individuals randomly assigned to receive the personalized nutrition than in controls. So with the addition of DNA-based dietary advice resulting in the largest difference with the scores, meaning genetics matters in your health, right? So when we look at personalized nutrition, we know from the research, it improves the outcome in glycemic control, in inflammation, in metabolic markers, and in weight management. And so when we're looking at the GLPs, right, we know that the GLP-1s suppress appetite, but without the right foods, you're going to risk muscle loss, malnutrition, and metabolic slowdown. So just to remind you, we talked a little bit about this last week, but GLP-1 has three main functions. We're now learning about some of the additional ones, but they're more a side effect of how your body is controlling inflammation and oxidative stress and some of the things we talked about last week. But the primary mechanism of action of a GLP-1 hormone is it impacts the hypothalamus in the brain. What does the hypothalamus do? It is responsible for satiety, meaning appetite. So it suppresses appetite. So for those people who are on it, right, wow, I don't feel hungry. That's because it's working on the hypothalamus in the brain. The other area that they're seeing positive benefits is with addiction, right? Because these addictive behaviors also get triggered from the hypothalamus. And so it's this risk reward, all that kind of stuff that is now being diminished in the brain as a result, and why we're seeing such an impact, which I think can be super helpful in supporting someone with this. It is not the be all end all. It is meant to be supportive. So that's important. The other thing that we see with the GLP-1s is that it affects stomach, the actual motility in the stomach. So when we eat, we have this action of peristalsis. It's this contracting of the sphincters and of the actual muscle in the GI tract. And so the same thing, the stomach has to contract and release, and the intestines. So these GLP-1s slow the rate of this motility. So you feel fuller longer because there's more food in your stomach. That sensation of hunger happens as the food moves through the stomach, and the nerve endings are like, oh, okay, there's no more food. Maybe it's time to feed, right? So there's this whole mechanism of action that goes on. So it slows down the movement. This is partially why people are feeling nauseated, why they end up throwing up, and so forth. And so that's a big problem. It also is impacting some people with constipation and diarrhea, depending upon. So these are where all of these side effects come into play. We also know that there's GLP-1 receptors in the intestines, and some of the newer drugs like that have what we call GIP. So things like the trizepatide and the like Zepbound, for example, work on the GIP receptor, which impacts the motility or the sensitization. So people are feeling less of the side effects. So if you're feeling those serious side effects of the GLP-1, you may want to consider switching to something that also has a GIP in it. And I think, again, a trizepatide and the Zepbound do have those. And then it regulates insulin secretion, right? How our pancreas secretes insulin. So it tells the pancreas, secrete more insulin, go grab the sugar from the blood. And that's where we're seeing the blood sugar numbers come down, and regulation of things like prediabetes and diabetes. And it also impacts weight loss, right? So the less sugar we have running around, the less goes into our cells, and so forth and so on. So just important to understand the mechanism, because not everybody does. And I think it's important to know it's how it works in your body if you're taking it or if you're considering taking it. Okay. So then we look at the genetics layer on top of this in terms of weight loss and weight loss resistance, right? If you're not seeing weight loss on these things, or if you're not seeing weight loss in general, right? So I want to be clear that this is for both anybody who's on a medication or anybody who's looking to lose weight and you're struggling. So for a lot of women who are perimenopausal and menopausal, weight becomes a big issue. We know there's we know there's a metabolic impact in menopause. Science has yet to really understand that. I have some theories. We're not going to talk about it today because it's not a menopause conversation, but we do know that metabolically there's an impact, okay? And that many things, why if you're symptomatic at menopause, there's so many other things at play. It's not just hormones, okay? So it's really important to remember that. But when we look at the genetic piece and some of these genes that we see and we measure, if you have the FTO gene, we know there's an increased appetite and fat storage. So the GLP-1 might work on the appetite piece. But if you are also prone to things like fat storage and fat inflammation on some of this, then that impacts your how receptive and how your response to the GLP-1s. So this is where knowing your genetics, again, whether you are on a medication or not, is super important when it comes to weight management. Okay. And And so, again, we know this is a fairly new study. This was done in 2022, but this just shows that the fat mass gene, this FTO gene, does tend to cause weight gain, or we know that it actually is linked to, I'll have it on the other slide, but is linked to increased calorie consumption. And so it's what do we need to do in the behavior part of the work that we do to help people understand that if they have this gene, right? So a lot of it is validation. If you're struggling, it's not necessarily, you're not lazy, it's not your fault, you're not destined to be fat or heavy, but there's a predisposition, and how do we help support that, right? So again, there is like a double-edged sword with the GLP-1s because there's these genetic pitfalls. So the risk of being on the GLP-1 is the low protein intake or the low food intake overall. But specifically, we know that the GLP-1s impact muscle, okay? And so mainly because if you're not consuming calories, you're going to have a deficit and your body's going to lose weight, and it'll lose fat, but it'll lose muscle as well. We also see that there's B12, iron, and magnesium deficiencies. That's super important because all of these run your metabolic functions. And as I mentioned, constipation and nausea are exacerbated by slow detoxification genes. So we talked about this last week, a little bit of that, kind of those four pillars of health of, metabolic function, and detoxification is a big one. Well, if your body is not detoxing efficiently enough, then you're going to recirculate toxins, and those toxins get stuck in the fat cells, and we have a hard time losing weight from that. And it impacts many other things in our health as well. So we know that 30 to 40% of the GLP-1 users develop clinically significant lean muscle loss without dietary intervention. That means without diet and without exercise. And so what is sarcopenia, right? What does that mean? So sarcopenia is something that we generally see in much older adults, usually after the age of, I mean, we see it after the muscle starts to decrease literally as we age. So it's at its peak in its 20s, and then literally every decade after that, we lose about 3% of our muscle mass if we're not, this is where use it or lose it really comes into play. You've got to be doing resistance exercise. And I'm not just talking about lifting 5 pounds and doing this. You've got to be doing enough exercise that you are ripping apart your muscle, quite literally, those fibers, so you can build them back up. And if you're not, and you are on a GLP-1, you will risk losing significant amounts of muscle. The reason that, I mean, muscle, again, we talked about it last week, but muscle's so important for everything in our bodies. So what happens is if we lose muscle, we start hunching over, right? It affects our alignment, our posture, and then it impacts inflammation, hormones, and what we call reactive oxygen species, which leads to oxidative stress. We talked about that last week, in inflammation. So we really, really, really need to be looking at this. And I can tell you, I know so many people who are on these GLP-1s and not exercising the way they should. And what's going to happen is, remember, muscle is the engine of your system. And if you are not building muscle, you are losing metabolic capability, meaning how your body burns calories. Muscle is the only thing that burns calories. So if you are losing your body's ability to burn an efficient amount of calories, that leaves you kind of stuck when you come off of these things. And this is why we see this rebound weight gain, and it's a mess. So we can talk about that, but gotta be doing the weightlifting. Okay. So let's think about food, right? We talk about food as being fuel, right? But I talk about food as medicine, because food should be nourishing. Yes, we use food to fuel our bodies, but it is medicine, because literally the decision we make with our fork decides how well nourished we are or are not. And if we are not feeding our bodies with nourishing foods, and I'm not talking about macros, I'm talking about nourishing foods, then we are missing a big piece of the puzzle of how our bodies will behave. So remember, I talked about epigenetics. Well, food impacts. Food literally sends signals to our body. I'm going to show you some of the foods that actually are responsible for turning off and on genes. But don't forget, food, environment, relationships, your movement, your stress, and toxins will literally flip on a gene or flip off a gene. So the more of these things you have in your corner, the more adept you are at keeping your genes working optimally. Okay. So let's talk about some food rules if you are on these GLP-1s. Again, in general as well, but specifically for someone who's on a GLP, right? You should bear in mind. So we want to prioritize protein because that muscle is so important, but you've got to be lifting the weights, right? You cannot just eat protein and expect to build muscle from just eating protein. It doesn't work like that. You've got to create its structure and function of muscle. And if you're not doing something about the structure of muscle, protein is just added calories and fat. That's what it is. So it won't do too much for you. So remember, we talked about the genes that are involved here. So we want to pay attention to that. But we do know that high protein diets preserve lean body mass. Now, remember, we talked a little bit about this last week, but the protein goals are way too high. You should never be taking in 1 gram per pound body weight. Wrong. It's per kilogram of body weight. Very, very different. And you need to be exercising. This applies to someone who is exercising, lifting weights for at least an hour 3 to 5 times a week. If you are not doing that, you do not need excess protein. It will end up gunking up your liver and you'll end up putting on weight as a result. Okay. So we've got some really good sources of protein. I put on here the low mercury fish. You guys got to be staying away from tuna. If you are eating tuna more than once a month, you are mercury toxic. Bottom line, I tested all day long. I am telling you, fact, right? Tuna, swordfish, those big fish, grouper, all of these fish, high in mercury, pay attention to that. Yes, it is mostly plant-based because it's the cleanest protein we can find. Do I think we should, need to eat animals all the time? No. But again, you need to balance it correctly. Do I vilify meat? No, I eat red meat every once in a while, right? But because people say, well, what do you eat? Yes, I do eat red meat. I make a mean bolognese. I make both a meat bolognese and a vegetarian bolognese, right? That's how much I love my bolognese. But you do want to prioritize your protein in terms of how are you balancing it through the day, okay? And then we have fiber. We want to make sure we're focusing on fiber. Here are some really good plant sources of fiber. And I know Yenvy last week we had asked about sharing the PowerPoint. I will share this one so everybody can have the reference for this. Okay, so you guys will have the information for this. Okay. We want to look at micronutrients. Again, food should be nourishing. It is not just about calories. We've got to be eating foods that are going to replace these minerals and nutrients that are getting lost. So we see common deficiencies, B12, folate, magnesium, and potassium in people who are on the GLP-1s. These are the genes that are involved, right? But we know that up to 38%, it's a big percentage of people who are on the GLP-1s show a B12 deficiency within a year. So we want to make sure we're prioritizing the right kind of B12, right? You should never be taking cyanocobalamin. For those of you that have supplements, please make sure that you're not taking cyanocobalamin. That is cyanide, that is poison, okay? And make sure if you're ever getting a B12 injection, it is not cyanocobalamin. It is either methyl and or hydroxy or adenosylcobalamin, but you can always hit me up for that if you want more information. Again, we talked about detoxification. We have got to be looking at detox pathways. There are genes involved in detoxification. If you have genetic implications in those, it will impact your health. So, we know that these cruciferous vegetables, that these foods that support them actually can reduce oxidative stress markers. When there's a reduction in oxidative stress markers, there's a reduction in cancer. This is how it all works, right? We talk about these lifestyle connections. This is it at play. All right. Hydration. So this is a big one. Everybody is like putting salt in their water. I would not recommend it. It's on here. I don't love sea salt as an option because you're only replacing the sodium. You're not replacing other minerals, and we need other minerals. The minerals, and water is not enough because water doesn't have all the minerals. So I'd much rather you do something like a coconut water. You can dilute it, right? There's a lot of sugar in coconut water. Do 2 ounces of coconut water and the rest water. That's what I do. I put lemon and lime or orange slices in my water. Sometimes I put fruit in my water, but you want to make sure, and if you eat the stuff, right? Eating this stuff is what'll give you hydration. These foods that are hydrating, these fruits support hydration. So you want to make sure you're doing that, right? GLP-1 therapy is associated with a 15% increase in dehydration side effects. So timing matters. Again, we know there are certain genes involved with timing. So we want to optimize digestion. We want to optimize energy intake. It's not always smaller, frequent meals. I mean, for some people that helps. But again, this is where personalization is key because it's never one size fits all for everyone. Okay. But eating in alignment with circadian rhythm for your genes improves insulin sensitivity by 25%. So important. We know insulin sensitivity is there anyway with the GLP-1s, but for those of you that are not on it, this matters, okay? And this is the plate, right? Your plate should be mostly vegetables. Your plate should be a small amount of protein and a small amount of whole grains. I would rather even see starchy vegetables. So this is what your plate should look like. If you eat this way and if you eat according to your satiety signals, your hunger, are you eating when you're hungry? You're stopping when you're satisfied? That should be good. You don't need to count calories. Okay. And foods that naturally enhance GLP-1s, your fermented foods, your omega-3s, polyphenols. Polyphenols are tremendously important. You've got some examples of them over there, okay? But we know that polyphenol-rich foods increase GLP-1 secretion and improve gut microbiota, right? Your gut microbiome. We hear a lot about the gut these days. These foods naturally support gut health, okay? And then here are some of them. That's just a picture for those of you that like pictures, okay? What to avoid? We want to avoid ultra-processed food. This makes insulin resistance worse, especially in those FTO carriers. Saturated fat is a problem for ApoE4 carriers, and we want to make sure we are reducing those sugar alcohols like erythritol, xylitol, all of those things impact the medications, the GLP-1s, right? And their tolerance and resistance. So that's just your visual. Alcohol is a big one, guys. I know you ladies love your alcohol at the end of the day and to party with friends, but not only does alcohol increase your risk of cancer, more than 2 drinks a week increases a woman's risk of breast cancer by over 50% now. So that's a huge statistic, right? Again, talking about preventable lifestyle factors, big one. Food is information for our genes. Remember, I said to you, food sends signals to our genes. Everything we take in, emotions, toxins, and food affects how our DNA actually responds. This is a sample of what we get in terms of the nutrient from the genetic report. So again, personalized to what do you need specifically for you. So I just wanted to give you a sample of that. Bioactives, these are not necessarily vitamins, minerals, or antioxidants. They are literally compounds in foods that actually have been proven to go in and turn on and off genes on their own. So things like quercetin come from asparagus and apples and shallots. I can get you guys a list. If you're interested, reach out to me. I can get you a list of all of these foods and what we call our master ingredients. But sulforaphane, broccoli sprouts, best source of them. But broccoli, cauliflower, your cruciferous vegetables, anything in the cruciferous family, cabbage, cauliflower, bok choy, so forth, arugula, kale, those kinds of things. And curcumin comes from the turmeric root, right? So those things important to add. But it's important to eat color of all kinds and different food groups. And within those food groups, different foods in those food groups, because they all have different nutrients, okay? Herbs are important. I know in most other cultures, they use a ton of herbs. In American culture, we don't use enough, and herbs are medicinal. Okay, herbs and spices, as you see here, are medicinal in nature. They do something for not only for our health, but herbs talk to our genes just as much, if not more so than food, actual, food. So Important to start adding them to your diet if you don't already have them in there. So I always say we all start with a full tank of gas when we come into this world. It will go down. How do you refill your tank, right? You want to make sure that you are putting good food into your tank. And the future is precision nutrition, right? We know it's not about restriction, it is about personal nutrition. And as I always say, it's about balance, making sure you find the right balance in your life. So I know we went a little over there, but I wanted to make sure we got it all in. I hope that helps clarify some of this nutrition piece with the GLP-1s and just overall in general. So, any questions?
That was excellent, Meryl. I mean, that
Thank
was so rich in information. I loved it. I loved it. And we're going to distribute your deck. Thank you so much for sharing that. And then I'll talk to you afterwards on how we want to distribute it, and so that everybody has an opportunity to get, the deck and reference it for those ingredients that you were going over. And so I did
Absolutely.
have some questions, particularly because of the the sarcopenia, muscle loss, right? And so there's this trend in one is we start losing, 1% a year of muscle after like the age of 30 or something. So we're already going the other direction.
Yes.
And then after menopause, it increases as well. Sarcopenia, the atrophy of muscle starts to increase as well. And then now, because of Ozempic, we're accelerating that so much more,
Correct.
right? And I always say, being on a GLP-1, I say Ozempic, but being on a GLP-1, you have to be careful with frailty. You don't want to fall and break a
Oh,
hip
yeah.
at the age of 50, right? And so it's not just muscle degradation, but it's also the metabolic and the structural aspect of it
Uh-huh.
as well. And
Yeah.
and the part that's going to impact every woman in here, and everyone's going to hear this when I say GLP-1 impacts, there's this thing called the Ozempic face, right? Because your face is made of muscle.
Yep.
And so aging that, I know as vain as it sounds, there's a reason for it because our body is just made of muscle and your face is made of muscle. And so by accelerating the muscle atrophy, you're accelerating the atrophy of the muscle in the face as well. And so that's when sagging starts to.
Yeah, and you really can't get that back. So, it's really, I mean, you can do exercises for your face, right? But not everywhere, you got to do all those. You're going to be
Yeah.
doing that for a long time. So, most people are not spending time doing facial exercises. I mean, you can build up the muscle there, right? But realistically, it's not going to happen. But I'm glad you brought up the frailty point because people are going to say, well, all right, then my risk of osteopenia, osteoporosis, I'm just going to go on a medication. But the medications do not, will not bring back bone. They don't rebuild bone. They just cause reabsorption of bone in different places. So it's like robbing
Mhm.
Peter to pay Paul, right? So again, a whole other area. But when you lose muscle, you lose connective tissue, you lose the fascia, right? So like you said, we end up, as women, we end up with this like hunch, right? And our backs and our stomach muscles don't stay strong. And then when that happens, everything just starts to just become displaced and degrade, and it's this downhill slope. And so yeah, we're seeing these things happen much more uh at a sooner at a accelerated rate and much earlier than they should be happening. So it becomes a big problem.
And what happens, because I know some people when I talk to them, they say, well, I'm gonna microdose it, right? My doctor said I can be on it my whole life as long I can microdose. And that, like there's almost like a level of dependency or something like that that goes with it. And so I just love your take on that, just because of the
Right.
conversations I've had where now it's starting to be like, oh, microdose like this.
Right. Well, understand that that was the intention all along of these pharmaceutical companies, right? The pharmaceutical companies are not that altruistic. They're not doing out of the nature of their heart. They are doing it to make money. And their intention was to get lifelong members to the
Mhm.
GLP-1 club of your choice, right? And so they knew very well what would happen, and that as soon as people started to go off, they could go back on, safely. Here's the other thing is we don't know the long-term efficacy and safety studies of that. What I will tell you is we know that the body adapts, and this is why we start to see people needing more doses, more frequent doses, or whatever that may be. Then more side effects. But yeah, I mean, microdosing, yes, you can microdose to minimize the side effects. It doesn't matter though. You're still, if you don't, you're still not solving the problem.
Mhm.
And so if you're going to do the microdosing, fine, and you want to stay on it the rest, but you've got to pay attention. You will at some point, something in your body will suffer if you're not really paying attention to your foundation, the pillars of health.
Right,
It just will. And so we have yet to see the fallout from that.
right.
Um, it will happen. There's no question in my mind. We will see it because just everybody is being prescribed it, and it's sort of uh, loosely being prescribed.
Mhm.
And I don't always think so responsibly.
Right.
Right. And so we're going to see some stuff. We're going to see some fallout from it. I have, but again, like you say, I don't have the answer. Yes, people are going to be on it forever. Um, and that's for me is the tragic part of it is that do we really want to be on this stuff forever and ever and ever? So.
And I just saw an ad from MIDI Health, which is a digital health platform, like a telemedicine platform for women going through perimenopause and menopause. And they make the conversion for you to get HRT very easy, right? You get virtual medicine prescribed, and then all of a sudden you pick up, and it's been very helpful. It's been, bringing to the front line the thought of menopause, perimenopause, and then but it's also a prescriber for hormone therapy. But something they've added to their toolbox is, are you gaining weight from menopause and perimenopause? Join us. We have a GLP-1 to help you, right? And so,
Right.
could you just kind of touch on the tie between perimenopause, menopause, and then the GLP-1s, and then, will that help reduce the weight gain from menopause? I mean, it will. But, what's the impact of it?
Well, here's the thing. Remember, when we're looking at menopause, the weight gain, again, yes, that we know there's some metabolic impact of menopause, and science is trying to understand exactly what it is. I don't know that we'll ever know. Our bodies are very intricate, and everybody's body is very different. So I don't know that we really will know, right? Why some people respond and what that metabolic, who knows if that is a survival instinct or not, right?
Right.
I think as women continue to live longer and age out of menopause, right? We're now living longer in menopause than we were premenopause, right? We're living longer without hormones than we were with hormones. So hopefully, science is catching up to us women because we are so neglected. But to your point, so here's the issue. If women are having a problem perimenopause and menopausally, it's because there was a metabolic imbalance going into menopause. It wasn't that menopause caused it. The whole reason we see that is because remember, your hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, act as steroids in the body. Steroids help lower inflammation, they help offset the immune system. And so while we are cycling, we have hormones, all of these metabolic imbalances are kept at bay.
Mhm.
Now, all of a sudden, hormones are starting to diminish, and these things are erupting because the hormones aren't there to negate the impact.
Mm.
And the more we see that, and the more we are looking at science on this and the studies and the research on this, the more we're realizing, oh, yeah, if you're a metabolic S show, right? I don't want to curse. Right? If you are in metabolic dysregulation prior to menopause, guess what? In menopause, you're going to be full blown, like, I don't know what to do with myself kind of thing. So, taking the hormones will bring you back to balance because you're taking hormones now, right? So now that steroid effect has come back. And this is why people feel so much better for a short period of time. We're still also learning the impact on brain health and heart health. Again, I think where we're seeing that is because the depletions were already starting before menopause, but it's impacted, right? That brain fog and all that
Right.
is exaggerated because we don't have the hormones. It's not that we should take the hormones. And I believe in hormones. I took hormone therapy for a while. I think, again, much like in the GLP-1, if it helps mitigate the impact and the side effects so that a woman can feel normal and like herself and function in society, I'm all for that.
Right.
Right. But again, you still got to get to the root because at the end of the day, your longevity depends on that. So
Mhm.
short term, yes, but what is the long-term impact of that? Because, like I said, if you're taking hormones and you're not detoxifying properly, guess what? You're going to be that person who's taking hormone therapy and going to end up with some kind of cancer.
Mhm.
So, this is where we still have to look at how do we peel away these layers in our health to understand what impact, whether it's hormone therapy, whether these GLP-1s, you still got to go back and do the work. And the problem is people don't always want to do the work.
Right. Right. And so just kind of going back to exercise and nutrition and what to eat as a
You're right.
combination, right? Okay, let's say I'm on a GLP-1 and I exercise, but then I'm tired because I don't have any calories or nutrition to keep me energized, right? Are we seeing a lot of that where, yes, I know that I have to build muscle, and the best way to build muscle is I have to go build,
Right.
resistant train, but then I don't have the energy to resistant train because I'm not eating either. And so, is there an optimal balance to how we can navigate that? Let's say I microdose or whatever the situation
Right.
is.
Right.
Like uh, I'm not saying I'm anti-GLP-1 by any means. I've seen miracles with it.
Right. Right.
People who are diabetic, people who have heart disease, who are obese, and then more importantly, the addiction epidemic, right? And that's because, so I call GLP-1 more of the anti-consumption drug versus a diet
Right.
drug, right? Because it stops you
Right.
from consuming. And so
Yes.
even food is an addiction in itself.
100%.
And so maybe it's the way we want to think about the GLP-1 is, am I addicted to food and therefore I need to, have an anti-consumption drug. Just like if I drink alcohol all the time, I can't stop drinking alcohol. It's an anti-consumption drug. Maybe that will help with my addiction.
Yes, it will as long as you're on it. So wouldn't it be smart to then combine that with some kind of lifestyle intervention
Mhm.
that then teaches you about appetite and satiety? So we are coming out. I'm going to be doing a 12-week course on this because we know there's so many people out there. So stay tuned for this because it's coming. It's coming hopefully in May sometime that we're going to be offering a 12-week program. It'll be rolling to teach people exactly this because there's no support, not enough anyway, and there's a lot of support groups where people are just bantering back and forth, but there's no real education and there's no real intervention.
Right.
And that's what people need is we need the intervention of while I'm on the GLP-1 and I do have that suppression and appetite and desire, how do I learn to continue to understand the mental emotional aspect of that to continue it on my own without the medication?
Mhm.
Because this is what's happening. The rebound hunger is
Mhm.
almost inexplicable. We are seeing the rebound hunger come back in such a way. I have a client, a young woman who had such rebound hunger. She lost all this weight on the GLP-1, went off of it in 3 months. I think it was 3 months, gained like 30 pounds back. That is an inordinate amount of weight. It's just right.
Wow.
And so it's just like, it's we've got to go back to, like you said, it's the same thing, whether it's an addiction to food, whether it's an addiction to alcohol, where is that mental emotional aspect of this coming into play? And because we know a lot of this is from trauma from when they were young, right? People use food for comfort. People use food for every other reason other than nourishment. So if we don't address that, then we're back in the same place, to your point, right? And so, and I don't know that the solution is to be on this forever and ever and ever because I just, I think at some point there is that cost benefit ratio that you just don't see the same effects because the body gets used to it.
Mm,
And, I do worry about the potential side effects long term.
mm,
We don't know young women who are on it, does it affect fertility? We don't know if it affects long-term pancreatic function. These studies have not been done.
mm. So for the workshop that you're doing, um, is it something to the extent of if you're thinking about it or you're on it, is it just like a pacifier? You're doing GLP-1s right now, but you need the intervention of somehow to wean yourself off of the pacifier,
Correct.
right?
Correct. Or if while you're on it, learn the tools so that when you come off of it, you
Mm,
don't gain back the weight.
right.
And a lot of what we're going to talk about is that mental emotional aspect because it goes back to our belief systems. Like, where did the weight come from in the first place? It's not because you're lazy and it's not because you're not a good person. We blame ourselves and a lot of women that I work with, and there are some men too, but this is going to be just for women because I will do a separate male one because I think the audience is very, the impact is different. But as women, what was the message you were told when you were young by your parents and your family or your peers? That matters. And we take all of that and the belief system and cultural ideals into adulthood. And so I think the majority of people on these things are on them because of some past experience, some past trauma of not being able to understand how to even nourish themselves and how to feed themselves. They were on diets since they can recall, right? And so that speaks to you, and it's a lot of people. We know it. I deal with this every day, then you deserve to finally take control of your life in a way that's going to serve you moving forward, not just for the time you're on the meds or considering on the meds or 12 weeks or 16 weeks or a year or whatever, right? This is a lifetime.
And I just want to remind the audience, if you have any questions, please type it into the chat or just raise your hand and we'll,
Right. There is no stupid question because if you're thinking it, someone else is too, for sure.
if you have any questions, this is the opportunity. Oh, Roya has a question. I'll ask. Go ahead, Roya.
Hi.
Huh?
I think the chat is still disabled, by the way.
Oh, okay.
So we would love to have that.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for allowing me to ask. I wanted to ask Meryl, I was watching a webinar recently, and they were talking about people with thyroid conditions and that there's foods that we should avoid and foods that we should have. And one of the foods that I was having on a regular basis was cruciferous vegetables. And currently, I've just put myself back on a detox a doctor also gave me. And you just mentioned how good cruciferous vegetables are for detoxification. What if you have thyroid issues?
First of all, so that's a great question. And I hear that all the time. So, first of all, there's no data. There is zero data, and I'm talking about good science, that indicates that goitrogens, which are what is in the cruciferous vegetables or some of these other foods, impact thyroid health. As a matter of fact, it is the opposite. So I will tell you it's bad science, 100%. And the other thing is
Hmm,
that you have to consume buckets full of these things on a daily basis to even have any impact and that, relevance whatsoever.
really? And kale included in that?
Any of
Any
them.
of
It
them?
is bad data. Here's the thing, people
Interesting.
come along and they measure these compounds in foods and they isolate them and then they go and test them on certain things, right?
Uh-huh.
But foods act in combination with everything, okay? So there isn't, the whole idea about the lectin theory and all of these things and oxalates. I've heard them all, okay? There is
And the
zero.
micro tears in the intestines from kale. Your thoughts
No,
on? No,
no,
you
it
don't
does
agree
not
with that.
happen. There is no zero relevant data that is consistent that shows, and it has to be, when I say consistent, we're talking about many studies. We're not talking about one bad study,
Mm-hmm.
okay? That
Mm-hmm.
came from a researcher doing it, because this is what people do. They test things all day long and then they go, oh, wait, there's a correlation to this. Correlation does not mean causation. Very, very different, right? So I can tell you, I had a thyroid nodule. I still have it. It's small, but I eat so many cruciferous vegetables. My thyroid function, and I have taken myself off all of my thyroid meds at this point. My thyroid function is perfect. And I eat a ton of this stuff, right? I'm not
What's the, how can you have
right.
a nodule and it's perfect? How does that work together?
It's a different mechanism. So a nodule
Mm,
is actually a calcium buildup from something else. So
I
that's a
see.
whole
Okay, enough
topic
of that
unto
thing.
itself. I'm happy to talk to you about that when I talk to you
Yeah,
offline.
yeah, no worries.
But yeah, so I would not fall into bad science, that conundrum. And
Thank you.
yeah, this is what happens when people listen to, so-called experts. And I don't blame you. It's hard to discern that, right?
Thank you very much.
You got it.
Thank you, Roya. Something something interesting is that when we read a book or we see the science, we have to ask ourselves what are they selling? You know, because a lot of times I'll read some research or science and it's like take this MCT oil or take this supplement or you know what I mean?
Great, great, great. Take your AG1 greens. Okay,
Yeah,
right,
so I and then being in the health industry and the science and supplements, I've done it all and I know exactly how research works is that we look for people who can run the research for us on a product that we're coming out with, right? And sometimes, we'll donate money to certain departments of universities to do research for us. And so when you're in that space and there's a background, like I have a background in understanding marketing around healthcare information. Just because I've been in it for so long, I know, what happens when you put people on the podium to talk about your products and that kind of thing, right? It starts to become believable, but that's for another day, another subject. But
right.
I'm only mentioning that because we really have to be careful with what we believe when it comes to the new trend and the new things. And I'm a biohacker just because coming from a background in science and research and engineering, I love just experimenting and saying, how do I feel on this? But
Right.
that's because that's my own self-disclaimer, right? Knowing that I may get very sick doing this. And there's been a lot of things I've gotten very, very sick on because it just didn't work for me. But I like doing all that. I do everything just to experience it. I'm a nut job in that way. Um, and does anybody else have any questions? Thank you so much, Roya, for your question. No? Okay, so one thing I wanted to bring up, and you said tuna. As soon as you said tuna, that killed me because I eat so much tuna. And especially when I was training, and I needed to have a lean body because I was doing a bikini competition. And so I was down to like 10% body fat. I was malnourished, my hair was falling out, I was going blind, but my trainer had me do, I should have called you for help. I don't know why I did it. I was just
Yeah,
listening to my
yeah,
my trainer so that I can like, be on stage.
yeah.
But I was eating tuna like every single day, right?
Ooh.
And canned tuna. And I'm one of those people that can eat the same thing every single day,
Right,
but know
right,
the
right.
purpose for it. And so when you said mercury, I was like, oh gosh. I gotta go get a heavy metal test. That's one. And then two, and as I was like, well, what's the alternative? What about sardines?
Yeah, so the small fish, small bony fish, sardines, salmon's a great, small fish that are not these big fish. If you guys want to go, it's EWG, environmentalworkinggroup.org. They have a seafood guide. So if you put that in and you go and you put in seafood guide,
Yes.
it'll spit out, you put in like you have to answer some questions, but it'll spit out the fish that are lowest in mercury and then highest in mercury. And I would definitely go look at that because it's a great resource. But the big fish like the tuna, the swordfish, the sea bass, grouper, those kinds of things are going to be super high in mercury. And mercury is a heavy metal. It hangs out in the body, it hangs out in the brain. So when we talk about Alzheimer's and cognitive decline, that's an issue. When we talk about women who have PCOS and endometriosis, heavy metal toxicity is an issue, right? Liver issues. I mean, so heavy metal toxicity is a big thing.
Yes, 1000%. And you touched on sugar alcohol, which is in all of our like protein bars, basically. That's
Right.
why they taste sweet, right? It's there's a reason why you like them because this one tastes better than the others because there's
Yep.
sugar alcohol in it to make it taste sweet. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how that impacts GLP-1s if you were on it, for example? I know it's all in the gut somehow or
Right. Well, it's the receptors in the gut. So, and it'll impact how your body absorbs, sugar and so forth. And so it can impact the GLP-1. I don't offhand, quite frankly, know the mechanism of action on that, off the top of my head, but I know it impacts it in some way in the lumen or the intestine of the gut. So, and we know, look, there's been research on erythritol that has come out that is not great. It's not great for you, especially from a cardiac standpoint. Xylitol, not terrible, right? There's mannitol. A lot of these sugar alcohols cause people to have gut irritation, right? GI distress because they're not absorbed, and some people get gassy and diarrhea from them. Allulose is a fairly new sugar alcohol that has less of those impacts. Again, it's been out fairly new, relatively new, so we don't have too many long-term research studies on that. I think that's the most benign of all of them, even in terms of GLP-1 impact. But here's the thing, if you're eating foods like, don't eat foods with sugar alcohol because they're non-nutritious. You've got no nutritional support in those. So if you're eating so small as it is, like every meal needs to count if you don't want to have any of these, deficiencies and or side effects. And these deficiencies are big because it will impact your metabolic function and it'll impact everything, brain health, all of that, heart health, metabolic health.
right? And let's see here. Um, you talk about a predisposition of the gene, right? With the FTO gene. And we're not, and you mentioned we're not sure about, if you're having a hard time even losing weight on GLP-1, for example, and it could be because of the FTO gene itself. Is
Well,
that
that's one of the genes. There's FTO, there's the adiponectin, ADR genes, right? And then there's other genes. There's the insulin resist. So there's many genes. There's the leptin gene. So all of these things are going to impact weight loss resistance.
okay? And last question. They're coming out with because I know with the GLP-1, it's the injection, right? But now they're coming out with the oral. And so does that take a different pathway, you think, or is it like how does that differentiate
Well,
it?
I mean, it's a different, well, first of all, anything that's taken orally has to go through the liver,
That's right.
right? So you have to go first pass, what we call first pass liver first pass. And so it has to be metabolized by the liver. So I guess it really comes down to how how efficacious, how efficient is it going to be in the breakdown phase, right? Some of these things have to get through the stomach, the intestine, then go through liver circulation and re so it'll be interesting to see what that is. I don't know, offhand what that mechanism of action is in terms of how that differs, how they're keeping it stable, right? What are they doing? What is that looking like? So, but so I don't know that answer yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
It'll be interesting because
will we will, but we don't know it yet.
yes, exactly. I think Lily,
Lily, yeah.
is coming out with that. And that's one of
Yeah,
the
they're all racing to do it, obviously because they see the how successful these are, and the question is it gonna are they gonna be able to do it?
yeah,
I mean, at some point, maybe yes, maybe I don't know that it will be as efficacious. It'll be interesting, it'll be interesting to see what happens.
right. Okay, so we're just about a minute away from the top of the hour. So thank you so much, Meryl. Is there anything that you want to share with the audience on, what we discussed today, something that, they can take away? And then just keep an eye out for our email tomorrow with Meryl's information, ways to, to get her deck, and then also just a way to get connected with her if you want more advice or any questions or anything like that.
Right. Right. So as always, I will do a 15-minute, complimentary conversation with you. If you have questions that you didn't want to ask here, or if you come up with questions, or you've got your own struggles that you're dealing with and you didn't want to ask it here, reach out to me. I will happily, spend some time in responding to that, or other kinds of things. But I think, the bottom line is that it's really about paying attention to where, what's going on here. How are those imbalances serving you, not serving you, and how do you make a change? And I think the most important thing is that it's a process and it doesn't happen all at once. And we really meet you where you're at and really support you where you're at so that this journey becomes your lifelong lesson of how to take care of your body.
Great. Thank you so much, Meryl, for joining us.
Thank
I
you.
look forward to
My
more
pleasure.
webinars with you. You're a wealth of information, great information, and well-researched information at that. And so, and no bias either, which I
Nope.
so
Not looking
thank
to
you.
sell anything other than myself. So there you go.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Meryl. Have a wonderful day.